As we pay tribute to Brother Tom Holland, one of the things that stands out in my mind, and I know in your minds as well, he was a great writer. He was a tremendous teacher and preacher, but he had the ability to take what was here and put it on paper. And not many people have that kind of ability. Brother Paul, I know that you helped publish many of his books. How many books did he write?
I'm not positive. I have been told by one of the family that it was 90 some odd, but a year before he passed away, we published one on unity, and in that book he put on the inside my 86th book. 80, 90, it doesn't really matter when you get to that point.
No, wait, think about that. 86 books. I mean, can you imagine the time that had to have been spent? I remember listening to him. He was at East Hill. I was listening to it on YouTube one day, and he was talking about being in a gospel meeting somewhere. He didn't say where. I think it was in Florida possibly. And he said, I spent every day in my room writing. He said, I never turned the television set on one time. Put a lot of time in.
Yes, sir. It was evident. I'll pull out my pen. We were privileged, honored to be the publisher of many of his books. But I've got to tell you, they were in longhand. He didn't have a typewriter, or at least that he used. He didn't have
he wrote them by hand.
I received them in longhand, each one of them. Treasure them right now. Some of the last ones that he wrote, for an example, the one on Blessed Assurance. That was a tremendous book on confidence that we can have. His autobiography as well, all written out in longhand. And he would oftentimes say, I know you may struggle to read some of this. Well, my daughter Heather would oftentimes be the typesetter for some of those books, and she had it down where she could pretty well write anything that he wrote that way, or type out rather. But just think of him sitting, and I've often thought of this imagery, whether at home or whether on the road in a motel, as you were saying a moment ago. And he would write on the yellow ledger pieces of paper.
Legal pads.
But then he would have it all written down, this page to be full. And then at times he would turn it over and he would write about that much more or something like that and put an asterisk, turn it back over here and say, insert this here. So it was like a maze almost. I don't do that to anything except just the greatest of esteem. Not to in any way make light of how he did it, but the mind that he had to be able to do that.
I would treasure those notes, as I'm sure you do.
Yes.
I remember hearing Brother William Woodson say that Brother Gus Nichols brought him in his office one day and gave him a copy of his debate notes. And he said, I treasured those notes more than my doctorate degree. Now, that is tremendous admiration for somebody.
Yes.
Brother Jimmy, all the books that Brother Holland wrote through the years, is there any particular book or books that really just stand out in your mind?
Well, my dad being an elder, as well as a gospel preacher, and my dad and Brother Holland were very close friends, particularly toward the close of my dad's life. And Brother Holland wrote books that had to do with elders and appreciating elders. And he understood, not being an elder, but watching elders and working under elderships, the importance of being able to encourage these men. And there have been other books written for elders to encourage them to do that work. But when Brother Holland would watch things that went on in local work in particular, he was a firm believer in local preachers and in local works. He was training us as a student to do local work. Now, you could do foreign mission work or local mission work in some place, but he would write. I remember when I was a student there, the Freed-Hardeman lectureship was a deadline time on a particular book that he would write. And generally it would be a book of the Bible. He would take a different book of the Bible every year and he would write a sermon outline book for preachers. The deadline was the Freed-Hardeman Lectureship.
Is that right?
Okay. And he would tell us, I'm now in the book of Ephesians. I have dedicated my entire year, this year, to the book of Ephesians. And I'm writing sermons now to put in a book form in the deadline of the Freed-Hardeman Lectureship. So that when these local preachers come into the lectureship and they walk up, they said, do you have the book for this year? Because they were preaching his sermons out of that book. And he says, now the next year I'll go to a totally different book. I like 1 John on blessed assurance, and then Hebrews on faith, Ephesians on the church. I mean, just basic topics. But he would say, I'm going to spend my entire year in preparation for writing this book on this book of the Bible. And that was an amazing thought. I was thinking, you're going to spend an entire year on one book of the Bible on top of everything else you have as responsibility. And yet, he was concise to it, 3 points in that lesson, and it was like, I can't preach that sermon, but I could take the ideas out of that sermon in that sermon outline book and make a sermon that fit exactly the way I knew how to preach.
That's exactly right.
But the fact is, it was so simple enough and basic. Any preacher could do that. You couldn't write a sermon outline book like he wrote, but you could take his material and then move from that.
And you could take that material and make it your own.
Sure, yes.
You made mention a moment ago about Brother Holland being able to quote Scripture and put the punctuation marks. He would accentuate those at the right time. And I think that has something to say about the fact that he knew the one that inspired this book. And I couldn't help but think about, as you were talking about the book he wrote, The Ways of Wanderers. And if I recall correctly, in one of the chapters, he said, I want to talk to you about a friend of mine. And he was talking about Jeremiah. And I thought, that's the way we ought to view Scripture. That, I mean, to him, they were comrades, the Jeremiahs and the Amoses, and he loved Jeremiah. And I can't tell you how many lessons I heard him preach on Jeremiah. But you had the ability to spend a lot of time with him as a writer and as an author, and no doubt y'all bounced a lot of things back and forth.
He would oftentimes call and say, this is the chapter I've got so far, or I've come up with a new idea, or this idea I'm going to write, but now Diana's singing's coming up. I want to make sure, just like you were talking about Freed-Hardeman and so forth, he would often have a deadline that he would work with. Jimmy, as you were talking a moment ago, one of his books was entitled Encouraging Elders.
Right.
Another was Encouraging Deacons. Another was Encouraging Teachers. The word encouraging was so important to Brother Tom as far as to try to build up and lift up.
The both of you mentioned something about deadlines, which I think says he was a very disciplined man. And you don't preach locally. I remember when I was at Lipscomb, he preached for Creve Hall. They had 1,500 members. He taught school. He was also a part of Nashville Bible School. He was preaching meetings all the time. Right? I mean, he had to be disciplined, didn't he?
For sure. Matter of fact, he mentioned to me about 10 years ago, our paths had crossed many times through lectureships, different ones, most of them very small lectureships. And I would ask him about manuscripts that we had to get done at a certain deadline so that the book could be printed and be ready for the lectureship. And I said, well, have you got your manuscript done for this particular lectureship? He and I were going to be on the same lectureship. He says, I've got 17 manuscripts due, something along that line, double digits. And I'm like, well, I feel sorry for myself. I've got 2 or 3, and here you've got all
17.
these manuscripts. He had all these manuscripts. I don't know if it was exactly 17, but it seemed like it was double digits.
Wow.
And I'm like, and you've got time to do that and then this? I mean, when do you sleep? When do you eat? When do you do anything but focus on all the different projects that you've got in front of you? And yet, when it came time to the lectureship, there was his manuscript in the book. I mean, it was done. When he got it done, when he turned it in, I have no clue. But he got it done. And so when you talk about discipline, it forces you if you're going to do this work and do it effectively and not piecemeal it, it is, number one, I have to know what I'm doing, okay? And number two, I have to understand that I have to structure this and structure my time and my own value system to where I can get all of this done. And as a writer, he was a master at being able to write that and do that and communicate it not to the highly educated person, but to the common person that didn't know Greek and didn't know Hebrew, just knew the English text of the Bible. And to be able to share that in such a simple way, I mean, it looked easy, but trust me, it is not easy. It wasn't easy.
I think that's what made him so well loved by the people, because he was there for the common person. He just had that ability. And the word that comes to mind, balance. I mean, how can you do all of these different things in life if you don't have some type of balance there?
Right.
When we talk about Brother Tom, we've already referred to his soundness in the faith, how much he loved the truth. And we certainly would do that and appropriately view it that way. Toward the last couple of 3 years of his life, the books that we actually published for him, I believe, reflected a passion of significance. One, for an example, was on the title of 10 Reasons Why I Cannot Join Your Denomination. And there were multiple chapters inside, each one taking a particular denomination, and he enumerated the reasons why he could not. It was not mean-spirited, it was loving, it was biblical. One of the near the last ones was on unity as God planned it. The emphasis being upon we are to be united. God's plan desires that we speak the same things and preach the same truth. But you could tell the passion, the fervency of spirit with which he was writing during these times on these vital subjects.
I think so. I think you're exactly right. There was a desire to get as much done. You know, as Jesus said, the night comes when no man can work. And one of the things I wanted to touch on before we close this segment, we've got about 2 minutes left or so, and that is, you mentioned his autobiography. And there were a lot of raw emotions in that book. I think that he gave us insight into some of the deepest, darkest hours of his life. And that says to me, you have to be pretty humble to be able to let people know and really to take people where you have been. Maybe talk a little bit about that autobiography, if you would.
He was not vindictive. In the autobiography, when he would write on some of those subjects that were extremely sensitive and raw, it wasn't like he was trying to strike out and do damage or hurt someone, but he was just basically revealing the bones of his feelings. And he was a human. He was a human being that made mistakes just like we all do. And he even, in some of that, the writing of that book, he even admitted, I have fallen short in areas and so forth. If we all are truly honest with ourselves, we would echo those sentiments. We've all failed. But he wanted very much for his story, as it were, or the things that he had walked through and the valleys, not just the mountains, not just the accolades, but the mountains as well in which he endured.
I think so. And David penned many of our Psalms. And it'd be great if we could all live on the mountaintop, but the fact of the matter is we're in the valley a lot of the time.
Sure.
And Brother Holland had the ability to take us to the height of the mountain, and then you're down in the valley with him. And I think there's something about his willingness to open up and to just share his feelings and his despair. Mm-hmm. And yet here was a great man of God who, like David, found himself in the valley, but he remained faithful to God, and his trust in God never wavered, which I think is important.
Did you know he wrote a novel too, Mike?
I did not.
He wrote a novel. It was, 8 or 10 books ago, called Rendezvous with Death, I believe was the title, something like that. It was a novel about an Indian who was approaching death. He had cancer, and he ultimately died in the story. But it was, again, a revealing of the soul of this great man.
How about that? We're going to pause here. We'll come back and talk more about Brother Highland, and particularly we want to focus on his preaching salvation.